Here he is, friends. He got his suit back just in time. And no matter what happens in his life, he gets absolutely no respect.
For 3 decades, The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, shaped American comedy. It launched careers, defined culture, and captured the country's nightly mood. Millions tuned in to watch, laugh, and unwind before bed. But buried within that vast archive of jokes, interviews, and chaotic guest segments lies a side of late-night television most people have forgotten. A time when racially insensitive humor wasn't just tolerated. Many became legends. But some walked onto that stage and delivered moments that now feel jarring, uncomfortable, or outright racist. Stay tuned as we revisit those moments and examine what they reveal about comedy, culture, and the television that once defined America. Number 7. Don Rickles. Don Rickles was a firecracker waiting to explode every time he walked onto Johnny Carson's stage. The audience loved him because he said things no polite guest would ever dare to say. He broke rules. He crossed lines. He made people gasp and laugh at the same time. But that same wild, anything-goes style also created some of the most racially offensive moments in Tonight Show history. If you want to understand how humor and racism lived side by side in old-school American entertainment, just watch Rickles. His story tells you everything you need to know. Back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, comedy worked differently. Comedians believed nothing was off-limits. If you made fun of everyone, people called you brave and edgy. Rickles lived by that rule. He used race as one of his sharpest weapons. He went after everybody: black people, Asians, Arabs, Native Americans, Italians, Jews, Irish, Hispanics. Nobody escaped. His excuse was always the same, that he insults everyone equally, so nobody can say he is picking on them. But here's the problem. Equal insults don't create equal damage. When he aimed his jokes at groups already facing real discrimination in everyday life, those jokes landed harder and hurt deeper. Carson knew exactly what he was getting. Whenever Rickles showed up, Carson would sit back in his chair, fold his arms, and grin while the comedian fired off one racial joke after another. Classic Rickles moments included mocking how Asian people spoke, making fun of African tribal traditions, and tossing around slurs like they were normal words. The audience roared with laughter. Carson smiled. America watched and called it harmless fun. But if you watch those old clips today, they feel heavy and wrong. They show you just how normal racist humor used to be, even on the biggest show on television. One moment stands out in particular. During a Tonight Show anniversary special, Rickles walked out, looked at a row of famous guests sitting there, and immediately started imitating their ethnic backgrounds. He had exaggerated accents. He made stereotypical gestures. He threw out one racist impression after another, rapid fire. Carson tried to steer him away from it, but only barely. The message was clear. Rickles was the wild card, and they were letting him run free. The audience ate it up. They loved the chaos. But looking back now, there's no dancing around it. The content was racist. What makes Rickles so important to this conversation isn't just what he said. It's what he represented. By being one of Carson's most popular and most requested guests, he made a certain kind of comedy acceptable. He showed America that jokes built on racial stereotypes could be mainstream entertainment. Other comedians admired him. Television networks celebrated him. Magazines wrote glowing profiles calling him a genius. And in some ways, he really was a genius. His timing was perfect. His control of a room was unmatched. He could turn pure chaos into a punchline better than almost anyone. But being talented doesn't erase the damage. The stereotypes he repeated on national television night after night fed into real prejudices, whether he meant to or not. And here's where it gets complicated. Rickles wasn't a hateful person. Many of the groups he joked about, including Jewish people like himself, said later that they never saw him as truly bigoted in real life. But that's not really the point. The man himself isn't the problem. The material is. Those jokes didn't age badly by accident. They were built on ideas that hurt marginalized communities for decades. And because Carson's show reached so many millions of people every single night, those jokes spread everywhere. They became part of the culture. Rickles is proof of an uncomfortable truth about comedy in the Carson era. This wasn't underground humor hiding in dark corners. It was front and center, celebrated and broadcast in prime time. His appearances are still considered classic television, but they're also clear examples of how racism became entertainment in America. However, Joan Rivers was one of Johnny Carson's most explosive comedic discoveries. Sharp-tongued, fearless, and relentlessly fast. Number 6. Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers didn't tell jokes. She launched them like weapons, one after another, each one sharper than the last. Sarcasm, shock, social commentary. She had it all. But alongside her genius, Rivers also left behind a collection of racially insensitive material, and a lot of it came straight from her appearances on Johnny Carson's stage. Those Tonight Show moments became textbook examples of how everyday comedy back then routinely crossed lines that nobody would accept today. Rivers came up during a time when late-night comedy was almost entirely white and built on a foundation of stereotypes. Comedians took shortcuts. They made fun of race, ethnicity, and how people looked because it was easy and it worked. The audience laughed every time. Rivers learned fast. Her style was sharp and fearless. She went after everyone, celebrities, politicians, even herself. But when she aimed at racial and ethnic groups, those jokes hit differently. They weren't meant to be cruel, but they showed how normal it was to mock people for being different. During her monologues and guest appearances on The Tonight Show, Rivers frequently made jokes about Asian American communities. She mimicked accents. She made fun of driving. She joked about cultural habits. Carson's audiences loved it. They laughed loud and hard. But those same jokes also strengthened stereotypes that were already everywhere in America. She'd smoothly shift from a Hollywood punchline to a joke mocking an ethnic group without missing a beat. Carson would chuckle quietly or pretend to be shocked, but he rarely stopped her. He almost never pushed back. Rivers also targeted Latino communities, sometimes painting them as loud or overly dramatic. These weren't one-time jokes. They showed up again and again throughout her career. The jokes matched what comedy was like back then, sure, but they also show how late-night television helped shape what people believed. When millions of viewers tuned in every night, these stereotypes didn't stay on TV. They traveled into homes across the country. They became part of how people saw each other in real life. Some of the hardest moments to watch now are when Rivers made jokes about the Black community. She'd build them around assumptions about behavior or appearance, wrapping them into her fast-paced delivery. The humor always seemed playful, smart, and self-aware. But the punchlines still depended on tired ideas about how Black people looked, talked, or acted. Watching them today feels like looking at artifacts from a time when comedy ignored the real experiences of people who were already struggling. Carson saw Rivers' talent and gave her a platform that launched her entire career. But his show also became a place where stereotypes could flourish, all in the name of humor. Rivers wasn't the only one doing it. Almost every major comedian of that time did the same thing. But what makes her different is how often she appeared. She wasn't a guest who showed up once and took a risk. She was a regular fixture whose style became part of what The Tonight Show was. Here's what makes Rivers' story complicated. She wasn't a bad person. Off camera, she supported civil rights. She stood up for marginalized communities. She had friends from all backgrounds. But her comedy often didn't match that side of her. The difference between who she was and what she performed shows a bigger problem. The entertainment world rewarded jokes that punched down. If you wanted to survive in late-night comedy during that era, you often had to give audiences and networks what they wanted, even when that meant repeating harmful stereotypes. Joan Rivers' legacy is huge. She shattered barriers for women in comedy. She changed how late-night shows worked. She inspired countless performers who came after her. But when you go back and watch her early Tonight Show appearances, the racial material jumps out. Not because she was a terrible person, but because it reminds us how acceptable racism once was when it was packaged as humor. It wasn't hidden in the shadows. It wasn't whispered. It was broadcast on national television, cheered by audiences, and replayed over and over, becoming a permanent part of TV history that we need to look at honestly today. Meanwhile, Buddy Hackett was one of those Tonight Show guests whose presence guaranteed a reaction. Number 5. Buddy Hackett. Buddy Hackett walked onto the stage like he owned it. Loud, energetic, unpredictable. He knew exactly how to grab an audience and never let go. But underneath that playful, mischievous charm was a comedy style that leaned hard on caricature. Out of all the big-name comedians who sat with Johnny Carson, Hackett was one of the worst when it came to using exaggerated accents and physical mockery tied to race and ethnicity. Audiences back then loved it. Today, those same routines feel painfully wrong. Hackett's comedy came from the Borscht Belt, a style known for big gestures, over-the-top storytelling, and characters that were almost always stereotypes performed for laughs. The Tonight Show gave him a regular platform to do this kind of material, and he constantly used it. He'd portray Asian characters, Middle Eastern shopkeepers, or Eastern European immigrants using distorted facial expressions, squinted eyes, broken English, and heavy fake accents. To modern eyes, these are textbook examples of racial caricature. One of his go-to routines featured an exaggerated Chinese restaurant owner. He'd twist his face, change his voice, and slip into a mock Asian accent. It was a bit he'd been doing since the early 60s. Carson's audience exploded with laughter every single time. Carson himself would crack up, sometimes covering his face with his hands like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. It looked like harmless fun at the moment, but it showed a bigger cultural problem. These weren't real impressions. They were parodies. They turned entire cultures into jokes. Another bit Hackett loved doing was a stereotypical Middle Eastern merchant. He'd use exaggerated hand gestures and vocal tricks meant to mock how Arabic speakers sounded. The humor was framed as goofy, not mean-spirited, but it still depended on making fun of race and culture in ways that feel deeply wrong now. Hackett wasn't the only comedian doing this kind of material, but he was one of the most frequent offenders on Carson's show. For viewers at the time, these routines seemed innocent. They were sold as family-friendly comedies. Funny faces, funny voices, funny exaggerations. But humor like that does more damage than people realize. Every time Hackett put on an accent to play an Asian or Middle Eastern character as stupid, clueless, or clumsy, he reinforced stereotypes that already existed in America. These portrayals shaped attitudes and assumptions that real people had to deal with in their everyday lives. What makes Hackett's story even more important is how normal his routines were. He didn't act like he was being edgy or controversial. He delivered these caricatures casually, like they were just regular comedy. And back then, they were. The Tonight Show didn't treat this material as risky. They treated it as normal entertainment. That normalization is why Hackett belongs on this list. His appearances prove how racial stereotypes became woven into American comedy through constant repetition and acceptance. Carson almost never stopped him. Sometimes he'd shake his head or joke that Hackett was going too far, but those reactions were just part of the act. The way they played off each other actually made space for Hackett's caricatures to thrive. Carson would pretend to rein him in while letting him keep going. This back and forth made Hackett's routines some of the most memorable and most problematic segments of the entire show. But like the other comedians on this list, Hackett wasn't a hateful person. People who knew him off camera said he was warm, kind, and open-minded. His comedy wasn't built on hatred. It was built on a tradition that valued exaggeration over sensitivity. But good intentions don't cancel out harm. The jokes he told, the accents he faked, and the characters he played all fed into a comedy culture where mocking race was accepted and never questioned. Buddy Hackett's legacy is messy. He was incredibly talented and genuinely funny. He could take a simple observation and turn it into an elaborate comedic masterpiece. But his use of racial caricature is a huge part of his Tonight Show history, and it can't be ignored. Today, those segments serve as uncomfortable reminders of how casual racism shaped the humor of an entire generation, and how readily millions of viewers laughed along. Number 4. Bob Hope. Bob Hope was already a legend before he ever walked onto Johnny Carson's Tonight Show stage. His career stretched across vaudeville, radio, movies, and television, making him one of the most recognizable names in America for generations. But alongside his incredible talent for timing, delivery, and stage presence came a heavy dependence on racial and ethnic stereotypes. While most people accepted this at the time, it's now widely seen as problematic. On Carson's show, these tendencies got even bigger because of the platform and the enthusiastic audiences, creating moments that feel uncomfortable or downright offensive when watched today. Hope's comedy often relied on broad caricature. He turned African, Asian, Native American, and European groups into simplistic cartoon versions of themselves, predictable mixes of gestures, accents, and punchlines designed to get quick laughs. For example, he'd impersonate foreign leaders or tribal characters using exaggerated accents and over-the-top mannerisms. The humor came from making fun of differences rather than from any real cleverness or observation. These performances matched what mainstream American entertainment looked like from the 1950s through the 70s. But they also drilled racial stereotypes into the minds of millions of viewers. On The Tonight Show, Hope followed the same pattern every time. He'd walk out, chat with Carson for a bit, and then fire off joke after joke. Some were about Hollywood dramas, some were about current events, and some, especially in his older material, used ethnicity as an easy comedic shortcut. Carson usually played the straight man. He'd laugh politely, act surprised, or offer a gentle reaction. He almost never challenged the material. Instead, he helped package it as entertainment for a national audience. One clear example comes from Hope's monologues during special segments about international politics. He'd mimic foreign leaders with wild exaggerations, making them look foolish or ridiculous. Sometimes he'd add physical gestures meant to emphasize how different and strange they were. Studio audiences laughed hard, but looking back, these sketches depended entirely on outdated and harmful assumptions about culture, language, and identity. They show a time in American comedy when racism, or at least racial stereotyping, was treated as normal entertainment. What makes Hope's segments so important is the combination of his massive fame and The Tonight Show's enormous reach. Millions of Americans watched Carson every night, and Hope's humor went straight into their living rooms. Because he was such a huge celebrity, people rarely questioned his routines. Even journalists and critics mostly stayed silent. His jokes didn't exist in a bubble. They fed into societal biases and became part of a larger cultural pattern where making fun of race was just accepted. that doesn't erase the happiness he brought to many people, but it does put his Tonight Show appearances in a more critical light. Still, there's nuance here. Hope was shaped by his time. He rarely seemed to come from a place of hatred. Much of his humor simply reflected the entertainment world he grew up in. He performed for troops during World War II and continued doing USO tours for decades, often drawing from what audiences found familiar and funny. But that familiarity had a price. The humor depended on exaggerating identity and difference, and those exaggerations haven't stood the test of time. Bob Hope's presence on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show captures a key conflict in television history: the blurry line between beloved comedy and the spread of harmful stereotypes. His timing, charm, and command of the stage were unmatched, making him a classic guest. But the material he brought, with its casual, repeated use of racial caricature, reminds us of a time when that kind of humor was widely accepted, rarely questioned, and broadcast on one of the biggest stages in television history. Joan Embry may not be the first name that comes to mind when thinking about racial insensitivity on The Tonight Show, but her recurring animal segments provide a revealing glimpse into the subtle ways racial stereotypes were woven into seemingly innocent television entertainment. Number 3. Joan Embry. Joan Embry became famous for bringing exotic animals from the San Diego Zoo onto Johnny Carson's stage. Her appearances were supposed to be charming and educational, a fun break from the usual talk show routine. But underneath all the fur, feathers, and scales, some segments relied on racialized humor and caricature that reflected the broader attitudes of that time. Embry's segments often featured animals connected to African or tribal settings. The setup frequently included props, music, or commentary that leaned heavily on Western stereotypes of African cultures, sometimes painting them as primitive or exotic. For example, tribal-sounding drum music might play when she brings out a snake or a lion, and playful jokes would link the animal to stereotypical savage behavior. Studio audiences, used to these kinds of tropes, laughed without thinking twice. But to viewers today, these connections feel like casual racial caricature, linking wildlife to human cultures in ways that trivialized or twisted what those cultures actually were. One pattern that kept showing up involved pairing African animals with exaggerated commentary about African habits or customs. Embry herself was never openly offensive. She approached animals with real care and passion. But Carson's framing, the audience's laughter cues, and the scripted lines often made everyone complicit in laughing at implied stereotypes. What looked like light-hearted humor carried undertones drawn from long-standing colonial and racialized imagery in Western media. Some segments also played on humor that contrasted Western and non-Western ways of life. Jokes about how people in Africa would handle this animal or what a tribe would think presented entire cultures as one-dimensional and exotic. By turning these comparisons into punchlines, the segments quietly reinforced the idea that non-Western cultures were inherently different, strange, or amusing to the mostly white American audience watching at home. Carson's role in all of this mattered. He played the classic host, charming, friendly, slightly overwhelmed by the chaos of live animals. He let Embry deliver the lines while guiding how the audience reacted. His laughter, his smiles, his little comments helped normalize the jokes, even when they carried unexamined racial implications. The Tonight Show's format, built on live interaction and instant audience response, made these moments feel bigger and more acceptable. The humor seemed communal, like everyone was in on the fun. It's worth saying that Embry herself wasn't malicious, and the intent wasn't overtly racist. She genuinely loved animals and took pride in teaching viewers about them. But the structure of the show, the cultural context of the 70s and 80s, and the specific way these segments were framed meant that racial stereotypes crept in, even unintentionally. This points to a bigger issue in television history: how innocent-looking entertainment can keep harmful ideas alive when racialized context goes unchallenged. Looking back at Joan Embry's Tonight Show appearances gives us insight into the subtler forms of racialized humor in mid-century television. While her focus was animals, the patterns in her segments, tribal music, cultural exaggeration, implied caricatures, show how even well-meaning content could reflect and reinforce stereotypes. These moments might seem small compared to the overtly racist jokes told by other comedians, but they remind us that racial bias in entertainment isn't always loud and obvious. Even light-hearted programming can feed into a culture that normalizes these ideas. In the end, Embry's legacy is complicated. She inspired generations of animal lovers. She brought wildlife education into millions of American homes. She charmed audiences with her warmth and knowledge. But her Tonight Show segments also reveal how television could quietly embed racial stereotypes under the cover of harmless fun. In that sense, she's an essential part of understanding how comedy, context, and culture came together on one of the most influential stages in American television history. Number 2. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor holds a unique and complicated place in the history of The Tonight Show. Unlike the other guests on this list, Pryor wasn't racist. He's widely celebrated as one of the most groundbreaking black comedians in American history. But his early appearances on Johnny Carson's stage show us the tension between race, comedy, and the pressures of Hollywood. Pryor's material often touched on racial themes, partly because the entertainment industry back then expected black performers to address, or even exaggerate, their identity to appeal to mainstream audiences. This makes his segments important when examining racial dynamics on the show. In the late 60s and early 70s, Pryor's career was just taking off in an environment where black comedians were often boxed in. Mainstream television, including The Tonight Show, encouraged jokes that reinforced stereotypes, even if unintentionally. Pryor's early routines sometimes involved self-deprecating humor about African Americans, using slurs and caricatured behaviors as part of his act. On the surface, this might look like he was feeding into negative stereotypes, but context matters. Pryor was a master at exposing society's prejudice, while also navigating an industry that limited opportunities for black performers who didn't conform to certain expectations. One example comes from his 70s appearances on Carson's show. Pryor often included bits about everyday life in black communities, highlighting systemic inequalities and social realities. Sometimes he adopted exaggerated personas or used language that shocked white audiences to drive home the absurdity of racism. While these performances sometimes included words or images that feel offensive today, they were often tools for social commentary, satirical critique, or personal storytelling. Pryor was pushing boundaries in ways that mainstream comedy rarely allowed. Carson's role in these segments mattered too. He was a polite, accommodating host who let Pryor perform freely, though always within the limits of live television standards. While other comedians used The Tonight Show platform to deliver broad, casual racial humor, Pryor's comedy had a sharper edge, blending social critique with self-expression. The contrast shows the systemic pressures that forced black comedians into spaces where they had to navigate between being authentic and being acceptable. It's also worth noting how Pryor evolved over time. By the mid-70s, he was openly rejecting the old-style minority joke framework, crafting routines that confronted white audiences with uncomfortable truths about race in America. His Tonight Show appearances from this later period are noticeably different, less reliant on stereotypical setups, more daring in social critique, and hugely influential in shaping modern stand-up comedy. But those early performances remain a window into how even talented black entertainers were limited by the racial norms of the era. Including Pryor on this list isn't about calling him racist. It's about understanding how television, comedy, and systemic bias all came together. His presence on Carson's show shows both the creativity and the compromises required for a black comedian to succeed on a national stage. By looking at his segments, we see the nuances of race in late-night television, how jokes could reinforce stereotypes, how performers navigated pressure, and how audiences interpreted racial humor. Richard Pryor's Tonight Show legacy reminds us that comedy is rarely neutral. His performances reflect both brilliance and the limitations of an era where race shaped opportunities, expectations, and audience perception. Number 1. Oliver North. Oliver North's appearance on The Tonight Show stands apart from the other guests we've examined. Unlike comedians who relied on stereotypes for laughs, North's inclusion on Carson's stage brought controversy of a different kind. Politically charged, socially divisive, and, in some interpretations, racially consequential. North, a central figure in the Iran-Contra affair during the 80s, became a symbol of governmental secrecy, scandal, and systemic bias. His actions and policies, especially those affecting minority communities through the war on substances and foreign interventions, have been widely criticized as having racially discriminatory consequences. That makes his Tonight Show presence a point of discomfort for both audiences and critics. When North appeared on Carson's show, it was during the height of his notoriety. Millions knew him from his televised congressional hearings, constant news coverage, and his public defense of controversial actions. On stage, North came across as composed and friendly, answering Carson's questions and engaging in light-hearted banter. To casual viewers, it probably seemed like a typical late-night interview, charismatic, charming, entertaining. But beneath the surface, the segment represented a moment where a figure with a complex, racially charged political legacy was given a mainstream platform without real scrutiny. North's policies, particularly his role in the Iran-Contra scandal, had effects that disproportionately hurt marginalized communities. The covert support for foreign operations, combined with domestic policies like the expansion of substance enforcement programs, contributed to outcomes widely regarded by historians and journalists as racially unfair. The Tonight Show segment itself didn't directly address these issues, but the audience's laughter and applause normalized the presence of a controversial figure without fully questioning the implications of his actions. Carson's handling of North shows a broader tension in late-night television. The host's job was to entertain, to keep things moving, and to engage audiences. Carson let North present himself positively, even as public debate about his ethics raged outside the studio. By providing that platform, the show contributed to a subtle legitimization of North's persona, effectively smoothing over the controversial aspects of his record, including those with racial consequences. The segment shows how television could shape public perception, often in ways that downplayed the impact of policies on marginalized groups. Unlike the comedians on this list, North's contribution to the topic of racial insensitivity is indirect. It's rooted in context rather than content. His policies and the social effects of his actions carried racial implications, and Carson's platform allowed these moments to appear harmless or even amusing. This shows how Tonight Show segments could either amplify or hide real-world racial dynamics, depending on the guest and the framing. Including North in this discussion is essential because it broadens our understanding of racially problematic moments on Carson's stage. It reminds us that racial insensitivity wasn't limited to jokes or caricature. It could also show up in the uncritical presentation of controversial figures whose decisions had lasting, racially unequal consequences. While the laughter in the studio may have been innocent, the historical record puts the segment in a much more complex light. Oliver North's Tonight Show appearance highlights the intersection of media, politics, and race. Unlike Rickles, Rivers, or Hackett, the issue was never the jokes themselves. Instead, it was the normalization of a figure whose actions had measurable racial consequences. Revisiting this segment today gives us insight into how media platforms, no matter how entertaining, play a role in shaping public perception, reinforcing systemic inequalities, and framing the social narratives of an era. In this way, Oliver North's segment remains a powerful example of the broader ways racial insensitivity could appear on late-night television, not always through obvious jokes or caricatures, but through the subtle normalization of controversial figures whose actions disproportionately affected marginalized communities. By presenting North in a friendly, charismatic light, the show allowed viewers to engage with him as a personality, rather than confront the real-world consequences of his policies. This shows how late-night platforms could contribute to shaping public perception, minimizing complex social and racial issues, and highlights that racial insensitivity on television could show up in both humor and seemingly harmless political commentary. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and click on the next video shown on your screen.